After the birth of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea (DPRK) on 8 September 1948, the Soviet Union, which supported the small communist nation on the Korean peninsula, began to provide several thousand military vehicles to form the Korean People's Army Ground Force (KPA-GF). Among these vehicles, there were some BA-64 light armored reconnaissance all-drive armored cars. These had proven themselves during the Second World War when used appropriately. Used by the KPA during the Korean War, the BA-64 still proved to be valuable, even if the weapons of war had changed and the limitation of this 1942 armored car began to be evident. Welcome to this Tank Encyclopedia video on the BA-64 in service with the DPRK. Feel free to leave a like and subscription, as well as checking out our website for the full written article this video is based on, and countless others. In the 1920s, the only model of Soviet armored car in production was the BA-27. BA stands for Bronye Automobil, armored car in Russian. It was built by the Moscow Automobile plant on the chassis of the AMO F-15 truck. This was the licensed production version of the Italian Fiat F-15 truck. In the early 1930s, the development of armored cars in the Soviet Union picked up pace dramatically, despite a weak start with less famous models, such as the Dirankov 8, 60 produced, and the Dirankov 12, 33 produced. Other projects included the FAI and FAI-M, BA-20 and BA-1, the last of which gave birth to the powerful series of Soviet heavy armored cars from the BA-3 to the more modern BA-11. After the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army High Command realized that the older light armored cars in service were no longer adequate for the Eastern Front. Thus, less than a month after the start of the German invasion, development of a new light reconnaissance armored car began at the Gorkovsky Automobilny Zavod, or GAZ, Gorky Automobile Plant. After an attempt to modernize the BA-20, the GAZ bureau designers resumed the design of the LB-62, a light armored car based on the GAZ-62 chassis with a T-40 light tank turret. This was developed after analyzing a captured German SD KFZ-221. The new vehicle had an armored structure with fully welded plates mounted on the chassis of the new all-drive GAZ-64, which had just gone into production at the Gorkovsky Automobilny Zavod. By the 9th of January 1942, the first prototype was ready. On 17th February, evaluation tests began, and on 8th of March 1942, it was presented to Stalin at the Kremlin. Finally, on 14th of March 1942, after due modifications, the armored car was accepted into service. The new octagonal turret was open-top, so that the machine gun could also be fired at aerial targets. The armament consisted of a Degtyaryova Tankovy DT gas-operated flapper-blocking light machine gun chambered for the Soviet standard 7.62 by 54mm R cartridge with a firing rate of 550 rounds per minute. This type of machine gun was the tank version of the famous Degtyaryova Pekhotny DP model 1927, developed by Vasily Degtyarov in 1927. The DP has entered service with the Red Army in 1928. The ammunition consisted of 20 round-shaped 63-round magazines for a total of 1,260 rounds. The vehicles fitted with the RP-12 radios, about 40% of the vehicle produced, had only 17 magazines for a total of 1,071 rounds. The crew consisted of only two, a driver and a commander, a machine gunner or radio operator. The interior of the armored car was very basic. There were two access doors, one on either side of the driver. There was also a large frontal armored slot to see where to drive. On mid-production vehicles, two vision slits were added, allowing the driver to see towards the sides of the vehicle and use their personal weapon for close defense. A commander could exit the top of the turret and had two side slits from which to observe the battlefield. The motor was a GAZ-MM, sometimes called GAZ-64-6004, inline 4-cylinder liquid-cooled 3,280 cm3 engine, delivering 50 horsepower at 2,800 RPM. This guaranteed a top speed on road of almost 80 km per hour. The fuel tank was mounted at the rear, behind the gunner, holding 90 liters of fuel and offering a 560 km range, adequate for a 2.4 tons vehicle. A total of 9,069 BA-64 armored cars were produced between April 1942 and 1946, of which 6 were prototypes of various experimental models. 3,903 BA-64s, and 5,160 BA-64Bs. Exactly 3 months after the end of the hostilities in Europe, on 8th of August 1945, Stalin declared war on Japan. On 15th of August, the troops of the Soviet Red Army crossed the border that separated the Soviet Union from Korea, advancing without meeting Japanese resistance and entering Pyongyang on August 24th. As previously agreed with the Western Allies, the Soviet troops ended their advance about halfway down the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. There, they waited for the US troops that landed on the southern part of the peninsula on September 8th. After an attempt to unify the two states failed, on 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the south, with its capital at Seoul and presided over by Syngman Rhee. On 9th September 1948, the birth of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the north, with its capital at Pyongyang. This embryonic Stalinist state was guided by the first of a dynasty, the great leader Kim Il-sung. At the outbreak of the Korean War on 25th of June 1950, the forces of the Korean People's Army were divided into two armies. The First Army, under the command of General Kim Chek, consisted of the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 6th Infantry Divisions and the 105th Armored Brigade. They were ordered to take the Ongjin Peninsula and Seoul, the capital of the ROK. The Second Army, commanded by General Kim Kwang-hyuk, was instead composed of the 2nd, 5th, and 7th Infantry Divisions with the task of invading the central eastern part of South Korea in the direction of Inje. In total, there were 54 BA-64 and BA-64B armored cars in the KPA's ranks, which had arrived from the Soviet Union before the war. The BA-64 reconnaissance armored cars played a secondary role to the Su-76Ms and the T-34s of the Korean People's Army, the only other armored vehicles in service with Kim Il-sung's army. During the fighting of the early days of the war, the BA-64s encountered many difficulties. Although the ROKA had no armored vehicles apart from 200 M8 Greyhounds donated by the US Army before the war, the poorly organized ROKA forces made extensive use of anti-tank weapons such as the 57mm M1 cannons, M1 bazookas and derivatives, and 57mm and 75mm M18 and M20 recoilless rifles. At about 1800 hours of 26th of June 1950, around 20 junks and less than 10 motor gunboats and motor torpedo boats of the Korean People's Navy approached Gangneungpo, the northern tip of the Gimpo Peninsula, controlled by the Republic of Korean Army. The 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 12th ROKA Regiment opened fire and annihilated the KPA troops that were landing, as well as sinking a platoon of armored vehicles. These were probably BA-64 light armored cars or simple trucks mistaken for armored vehicles. They were aboard a junk which was hit by several 37mm armor-piercing shells from an M8 Greyhound armored cars. As the offensive continued, the BA-64s became increasingly rare. After the first phase of the Korean advance, there was a counterattack by UN troops, led by a daring landing at Incheon, 40 kilometers southeast of Seoul. This amphibious operation, planned by General MacArthur and executed on 15th of September 1950, led to the almost total annihilation of the Korean People's Army troops south of Seoul. A BA-64 abandoned due to a lack of fuel was a BA-64B of the 603rd Reconnaissance Battalion assigned to the 105th Seoul Armored Division, was captured together with the Gas-67 staff car of some North Korean officer near Busan in September 1950. In Incheon, after the landing of the Marines of the 10th Corps composed of the 1st Division supported by the 1st Marine Tank Battalion, 7th Marine Division, and the 73rd Tank Battalion, no DPRK tanks were encountered. The only armored vehicle that engaged the US troops was a BA-64, which was hit and destroyed by a 90mm shell fired from an M26 Pershing No. 34, commanded by Sergeant Cecil Fullerton of the 1st Marine Tank Battalion. During the Second Battle of Seoul, fought between 22nd September and 27th September 1950, some BA-64s of the Korean People's Army 43rd Tank Regiment were destroyed, but there is no more information. During this initial part of the war, several tanks of BA-64 and BA-64B armored cars were lost. By late December 1950, the time of the arrival of some replacements from the Soviet Union and China, the KPA had only 60 BA-64 armored vehicles in service. During World War II, when German patrols were armed at most with automatic weapons, the BA-64 had no problem. But in the 1950s, the BA had some problems. UN troops almost always patrolled with the support of an anti-tank squad armed with bazookas or recoilless rifles which could easily destroy BA-64s even at long range. After the initial phases of the war, there was a long stalemate that lasted from July 1951 to July 1953. At this period, the few BA-64s still in service returned to a reconnaissance role and no longer undertook offensive or support roles. 9 years after its development, the small reconnaissance armored car was still effective while being vulnerable to any anti-tank weapon or reconnaissance vehicle of the UN troops, such as the South Korean M8 Greyhound armored cars, the M24 Chaffee light tanks used by various nations, and British Humber medium scout cars. Some vehicles were allegedly modified by crews on the battlefields, as Soviet crews did in World War II, with 12.7 by 108mm Dushka heavy machine guns and 14.5 by 114mm PTRD-41 and PTRS-41 anti-tank guns. These weapons created ergonomic problems for the crew and made the armored car heavier and more unstable, but provided some additional offensive options against the more powerful UN vehicles. During the war, at least half a dozen BA-64 and BA-64B armored cars were captured by UN troops. Two unit numbers are known, the BA-64B number 718 and the BA-64B number 749, which was captured together with another armored car, two Soviet M72 motorcycles, and other equipment on a North Korean train on 7th of July 1950. 718 and another BA-64 captured in September 1950 were packed up and shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States of America. Another BA-64B was modified by the mechanics of the 24th U.S. Infantry Division by removing the turret, front plate, fenders, and headlights for better visibility. They used it with new U.S. markings as a staff car for the 21st Infantry Regiment until spare parts ran out. The exact number of BA-64 and BA-64Bs used by the Korean People's Army Ground Force is not known, but it is possible that the DPRK received around 200 and 300 before, during, and after the Korean War. In the 1960s, the remaining BA-64s were passed on to second-line units and to the Workers' Peasants' Red Guards, a paramilitary force in the DPRK, which kept them in service until the mid-1980s. The BA-64 was an outdated light reconnaissance armored car by the time of the Korean War, suffering a very revealing number of losses during the early stages of the war when it was employed as an infantry support vehicle. As the war went on, the BA-64 and BA-64B armored cars still in service were used for reconnaissance, a task that they could still perform fairly well. They would remain in service even after the war's end, although the date they were taken out of service is unknown. This concludes Tank Encyclopedia's video on the BA-64 in DPRK service. We hope you liked it. Don't forget to check our website and our Patreon. And until next time, keep us in your sights.